Welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Carmen. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the director of Free Employment Relations. I have included a list of my credentials in the description below, just to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. If you've watched any of my videos, you might notice that I'm coming to you from a different location. I'm currently on a work trip in the west coast of the Western Cape, South Africa. So I'm coming to you from an Airbnb to bring you today's topic, which is everything about sick leave. So who does this video apply to? This video can be useful for employers, managers, supervisors, employee representatives, shop stewards, union official, employment relations practitioners, labor relations practitioners, industrial relations practitioners, HR practitioners, and pretty much anybody who wants some information around sick leave. However, today I'm specifically discussing sick leave as it is detailed in the basic conditions of employment. What that means is if your industry is regulated by a specific sectoral determination, there might be some variations in the regulation of sick leave for your industry. So you can still watch this video and gain some value from it, but you'll have to supplement the information from this video with whatever specifications or minor alterations there are in your sectoral determination. Similarly, if your company falls under the jurisdiction of a bargaining council that has a main agreement that has a different variation of how sick leave works, again, you can take the information from this video, but you will have to look at the main agreement or the collective agreement for your specific bargaining council to determine what are the variations to sick leave regulations for your industry. And there are quite a few bargaining councils who have a sick leave fund, and that is not something that you'll see in the basic conditions of employment. So information on that will be found in your main agreements or your collective agreements of your bargaining council. So specifically, this video is covering sick leave as it's detailed in the basic conditions of employment. Sick leave is one of those things that might seem quite obvious, but in my experience, I think there are quite a few common mistakes around sick leave, as well as maybe some misapplications or misinterpretations. So I'm going to go through exactly what sick leave is, the entitlement, and all of the common maybe mistakes or misinterpretations or misapplications that I've seen around sick leave. If you want to look sick leave up yourself, you can go to chapter 3 of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. You will find it under section 22 and 23. Things first, sick leave cycle. Annual leave cycles run for 12 months, whereas a sick leave cycle is 36 months. Leave cycles start from the first day when an employee works, and then they run, if it's an annual leave cycle, for 12 months from that day, and if it's a sick leave cycle, for 36 months, so basically 3 years. How sick leave works in the first 6 months of employment. During the first 6 months of employment, the sick leave entitlement is 1 day for every 26 days worked. Now, the first common mistake that I see around this is that annual leave has a variation in the Act where it can be calculated as 1 day for every 17 days worked or 1 hour for every 17 hours worked. So sometimes I have seen contracts of employment or payroll practitioners or managers implement sick leave as 1 hour for every 26 hours worked. Now, the Act specifically says days, 1 day for every 26 days worked. If it wanted to allow for the variation of hours, then there would have been an additional clause to allow for that. Therefore, because it's explicitly excluded from the Act, we cannot apply sick leave as 1 hour for every 26 hours worked. It's 1 day for every 26 days worked for the first 6 months of employment. When an employee has completed their first 6 months of employment, they are 6 months into their first sick leave cycle. So that means the sick leave cycle starts from the first day they started, not from after they complete those first initial 6 months. They then, after 6 months, have 30 months of their sick leave cycle left, and all of the sick leave taken during those first 6 months needs to be then deducted from the total entitlement for the 36-month cycle, the total cycle. A quick common mistake that I've also seen happen here is that sometimes the cycles are only started from when a person completes their probation period. Now, that's incorrect. It needs to start from the first day that they started working, irrespective of the type of contract or whether or not probation was built into it. Of course, with the exception being if they're an independent contractor, but then technically they're not an employee. For all employees who are entitled to sick leave, that will kick in from the first day that they start working. Now discussing the full sick leave entitlement. An employee is entitled to the number of sick leave days equal to the number of days that they would usually work in a 6-week period. So what that means is that employees who work 5 days a week, for example, are entitled to 30 sick leave days, because that's 5 times 6 weeks equals 30 days. Employees who work 6 days a week are entitled to 36 days in the sick leave cycle, so that is for the period of 36 months. So a common mistake and a quick plug in from my side that I've seen is that sometimes contracts blanketly say an employee is entitled to 30 sick leave days per sick leave cycle, so 36 months, without any consideration to the first 6 months of employment or the variation in the number of days that an employee works. So that would only be correct for an employee who has worked for longer than 6 months and an employee who only works 5 days a week consistently. So the quick plug in from my side, in my downloads website below, the link is there for a small fee, you can download my recommended sick leave clause that will cover variation in days as well as detailing sick leave as per the Act and as per my recommendation to put it into employment contracts. Another common mistake that I sometimes hear is where people say to me an employee has their 10 sick leave days per year. Now, I do understand where that comes from, because that's taking an employee who works 5 days a week, that times that by the 6-week period, that's 30 days. In a 3-year cycle, that brings it down to 10 days per year. But there's a specific reason that the Act said that the sick leave cycle is 36 months and not 12 months. Therefore, the entitlement is not 10 days per year. Entitlement is whatever their sick leave is, so be it 30 days or 36 days or any variation of that, depending on how many days they work a week. Entitlement for the entire period. Let's take an example. Somebody is in their first year of employment. Let's say they are in month 8 and they break their leg, they need surgery and they need to recover from surgery, so they need, give or take, 6 weeks off. They're in their first year, they're not in their first 6 months, they've completed that. They are entitled, unless they've obviously taken other sick leave days, to take that entire 6-week period off and have that be paid sick leave, even though they're only in their first year of their sick leave cycle. What that then means is if they use all 30 days or 36 days, so for the remainder of their cycle, they will have no more paid sick leave left. So if they do get sick, they will have sick leave, but it will not be paid sick leave. It will be unpaid sick leave. All right, last 2 points for section 22. The second last point is that an employee needs to be paid their usual daily wage on the usual payday for sick leave. Payment is dependent on certain regulations around medical certificates, and I will cover everything that you need to know about medical certificates and sick leave entitlement in a little bit. I just want to finish off section 22. Final part of section 22 cannot be done unilaterally. It is only by agreement between the employer and the employees or their representative. The parties can agree that the employee will not be paid their full daily wage for each day that they take off. Instead, they will receive a certain percentage of their daily wage, but then their sick leave entitlement will be extended by that difference in payment. So to explain it, the minimum is 75, so I'm going to take 75. An employee and an employer agree that the employee will only receive 75% of their usual remuneration for the duration that they take sick leave, but then their sick leave entitlement, the number of days that they can take sick leave, will increase with 25%. If we take the example of somebody who is entitled to 30 sick leave days, and there's an agreement between the employer and the employee that they only receive 75% of their remuneration for their sick leave entitlement, and hypothetically they want to take all of those 30 days. For those 30 days, they will receive 75% of what they usually earn, their usually daily rate for those sick leave days, and then you take their 30 times by 0.25, which will give them an additional 7.5 sick leave days. And those additional 7.5 sick leave days will also be paid at 75% their usual remuneration. So bringing this back to the example of the person who broke their leg, they need to take those 6 weeks off, but they don't want to have no sick leave left when they return to work. Therefore, they agree with their employer to receive 75% of the payment for that sick leave duration, and then they come back to work, and for the remainder of their sick leave cycle, instead of having 0 sick leave days, they now have 7.5 sick leave days that they can take, and those days will be paid at 75%. Again, this can only be done by agreement. So if you would like to use my template for that, in the downloads website, I have linked a template agreement for that, and for a small fee, you can download that. It is available immediately as soon as payment goes through. Moving on to section 23, and this is where things get a little bit more complex in my opinion. Now, this part is not in the act, but this is a strong recommendation from my side that employers, I would strongly recommend that you clarify your expectations around medical certificates prior to an employee needing to take sick leave. So make it very clear in some kind of induction meeting or in a document, in your contract, in your policies. But I would recommend making it clear to employees what your expectations are around a medical certificate, rather than the reliance that they've read the act and that they know how to comply with it. Back to what the act says, and I'm going to read it out and then we're going to unpack it. Section 23(1). An employer is not required to pay an employee in terms of section 22, that's the section that covers sick leave, if the employee has been absent from work for more than 2 consecutive days or on more than 2 occasions during an 8-week period, and on request by the employer does not produce a medical certificate stating that the employee was unable to work for the duration of the employee's absence on account of sickness or injury. What that means is if an employee would like to be paid for sick leave and the employer requests that they provide a medical certificate if their absenteeism from work extends for more than 2 days, so basically 3 days or more, or on more than 2 occasions, more than 2 times in an 8-week period, so basically 3 or more times in an 8-week period. We just always need to be very mindful of the more than or less than as it's stated in the act. So in this case, it says more than 2 days and more than 2 times in an 8-week period. And then just a reminder that it's only if the employer asks for it, meaning they request it, and therefore I am saying that it is helpful if employers state upfront what their expectations are around medical certificates. So a part of this is interpreted differently by different practitioners, and I'm going to explain both interpretations, and then you can make an informed decision as to how you would like to interpret it, and I will just say how I currently implement it. So the act specifically says that the person is absent from work for more than 2 days. Now, it doesn't specify whether those are calendar days or working days. Because it says absent from work, my interpretation of this means that we should take it as working days. So a person is absent for more than 2 working days, and then a medical certificate can be required. However, the alternative interpretation of this, let's take somebody who works Mondays to Fridays. Now, they do not usually work on a Saturday or a Sunday. And we say that they are absent on the Monday. That means technically they did not work on Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Monday would then be the 3rd day. And there are some people who interpret that to mean that a medical certificate can be required for the absenteeism on the Monday. Now, I do know that lots of contracts of employment and lots of policies state that employees must submit medical certificates on Mondays, Fridays, and the day before and after a public holiday. I will address that, but just a reminder that the legislation will always trump any contract, but I will discuss how that is implemented in practice, given that the legislation specifically refers to 2 or more days. So my recommendation with the interpretation of this would be to err on the side of caution and to take it as working days. So it would be 2 or more working days that the person is absent before they need to present a medical certificate to their employer to be entitled to paid sick leave. You can, of course, disagree with me on that interpretation, and if you do interpret that part of the act differently and you've had cases where it's been dealt with, I would be really interested to know about it. So comment down below and let me know. Now, here's one I get quite often, and I have a lot of empathy for this situation. And this is where employers get quite frustrated, or managers get frustrated, where they feel like an employee's taking a day off here and a day off there and a day off there, and then those days are always paid because they are under the 3 consecutive days because they're individual days taken here or there. And that's specifically where the second part comes in that we looked at, where it says on more than 2 occasions in an 8-week period. That part prevents the 1 day here, 1 day there from happening. So by the third time that an employee is absent, be it one day, in an 8-week period, an employer can request that they provide a medical certificate for that sick leave to be paid. This part of the Act specifically is there to curb the potential misuse of sick leave. I just want to quickly point out that it specifically refers to occasions. So what that means is it's not counting the days at this point. It's saying 2 or more occasions in an 8-week period. So an employee can take, for example, 5 days off here, and then 2 weeks later they take 1 day off, and then the next one will be the third occasion, irrespective of the number of days. All right, let's quickly discuss the company rules that says an employee must produce a medical certificate on a Monday, Friday, day before, day after a public holiday, because I know that those are commonly seen in contracts or leave policies. Personally, I recommend sticking to what the legislation says. That will naturally depend on the context, but I think that if it fits the context of your business, that would be my recommendation. I understand that some businesses do have major issues around sick leave, and there are major risks around employees being absent, so they try to ensure that sick leave is only taken when it really needs to be taken. So in those cases, I assume employers will want to bring in the Monday, Friday before and after a public holiday. So in this case, my recommendation for how to implement this, if you do want to go about implementing it, remember my recommendation is to firstly, if you can, just stick to what the legislation says. But given if an employer does implement it and they require that a medical certificate be produced Monday, Friday before or after a public holiday, the legislation specifically refers to payment of sick leave. Therefore, the policy can say we choose to take disciplinary action against employees who do not produce a valid medical certificate on Mondays, Fridays before or after public holidays. If the person is absent on a Monday, Friday before or after a public holiday and it falls under the 3 days or under the 3 times in an 8-week period, my recommendation would be to comply with the Act and pay that sick leave, and if deemed appropriate through a fair procedure, take appropriate disciplinary action if an employee did not comply with the company's regulation of submitting a medical certificate. We discussed a lot of days, a lot of entitlement today. As you might have picked up, having all of the correct documentation and records for leave will most likely assist with not unnecessarily paying for sick leave. So to keep records of sick leave, you're welcome to use my leave form. The template, again, you can download that from my downloads website, and for a small fee that becomes available to you. And that document is not specific just to sick leave. It is a leave form that covers all different types of leave that is granted by the legislation in South Africa, as well as a couple of additional leaves that companies might at their discretion give to employees. Moving on to, in my opinion, the even more complex part of understanding sick leave, and I'm going to read out the clause and then we will Now 23.1 refers to receiving a medical certificate, and 23.2 discusses more in detail the requirements of this certificate. And it reads, the medical certificate must be issued and signed by a medical practitioner or any other person who is certified to diagnose and treat patients and who is registered with a professional council established by an Act of Parliament. There are 2 requirements here. The first requirement is that the person be a medical practitioner or that they are certified to treat and diagnose patients. The second one is that they must be registered with a council that has been established in terms of an Act of Parliament. There's a couple of difficulties that I want to discuss around this that happens in practice. The first one is around nurses. Many people in South Africa go to clinics as opposed to a doctor. From the clinic, they might be referred to a doctor, but that's not always the case. At the clinic, they might only see a nurse. Now, nurses are registered in terms of a council that has been established by an Act of Parliament, but not all nurses in South Africa are certified to treat and diagnose as per the information I have at my disposal. There are, however, some nurses who are certified to treat and diagnose patients, and there are requirements around that. Now, when an employer receives a medical certificate that's been signed by a nurse, it will be quite difficult to determine whether this particular nurse was allowed or is certified to treat and diagnose patients. Therefore, generally, employers do accept medical certificates that have been signed by nurses. Of course, that is not to say employers have to accept those. They can go through the effort to verify whether or not the person who signed that document is certified to treat and diagnose patients. The second difficulty is that not everyone will decide to go to a medical practitioner per se, and they might want to go to an alternative healer. So they might want to go to a chiropractor or aromatherapist. In South Africa, doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists and the like will be registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. The alternative healers will be registered with the Allied Health Professions Council. Even if an alternative healer is registered with the Allied Health Professions Council, it is not necessarily that they are certified to diagnose and treat patients. If this is a frequent occurrence in your business, I would recommend that employers and managers have a discussion with the employees and come to an agreement as to which medical certificates will or will not be accepted so that employees know before the time. A recent example that I dealt with was psychologists in South Africa are registered with the Health Professions Council, and they are certified to diagnose and treat patients. Therefore, if a psychologist books off an individual for a certain period of time in their professional opinion, the individual is booked off and the medical certificate is accepted. However, in this case, an individual went to a life coach. A life coach is not certified to diagnose and treat people, so while they recommended time off, the employer did not accept this as a valid medical certificate. Again, if this is a frequent occurrence in your business, I would just recommend having a conversation with the employees as to what will and will not be accepted. But per the example I just discussed, life coaches' medical certificates at the present time do not need to be accepted as medical certificates. Final point on this topic, and this one is very important for South Africa. A great number of people in South Africa choose to go to traditional healers or sangomas. And herein lies the difficulty, because that is their preferred healer of choice, but it's highly unlikely that the traditional healer is registered and certified to treat and diagnose. Therefore, again, if it's a frequent occurrence in the business, employees would like to go to a traditional healer instead of a doctor who's registered in terms of the Health Professions Council, I would recommend drafting an agreement as to what will and will not be accepted, and have some way for the employer to determine how legit the specific traditional healer is that is possibly recommending time off, to give respect to the choice of healer that the individual would go to. But from the legislation point, if the traditional healer is not registered in terms of a council and not certified to treat and diagnose, technically an employer does not need to accept their medical certificates. Moving on slightly, but still kind of in the same realm, I'm going to combine this 23.2 with a little bit of something we saw in 23.1, where it stating that the employee was unable to work for the duration of the employee's absence on account of sickness or injury. While I was recommending that you draft some version of an agreement or a policy around alternative healers or allied health professions, and that would only depend on whether that is a frequent occurrence in your business, the one that I'm going to discuss now, in my opinion, is a frequent occurrence in most businesses, and I would actually recommend having a sick leave policy depending on the size of your business. Of course, you are welcome to use my policy template, and you can go to the link below and just for a small fee download that, and becomes available to you immediately, and it details the things that I'm about to discuss. First one is when employers receive clinic notes, typically just attendance notes. They are a note to say that the person was at the clinic on a particular day. This clinic note is not a medical certificate. This simply states someone was at the clinic. Now, the policy that I've drafted states these things to inform employees what will and will not be accepted. And a lot of employees don't know that clinic notes are not medical certificates. Another one, and it's very similar to the clinic note, which will be a kind of, it's not really like a medical certificate, more says, the person went for a checkup or a medical review. And that is not the same as a doctor booking them off. Again, that's simply stating that they were there on that day. Another one, and this is the third one, is backdated medical certificate. So when a medical certificate is backdated, it is unlikely that that would be in the doctor's professional opinion that the person is unfit for duty. It will most likely state as informed by patient. And again, employees do not know that the medical certificate needs to clearly state that it is the doctor's recommendation that they are unfit for work, because as informed by patient simply means the person said, I would like to be booked off for the last 2 days as well as for the next 3 days. That would not be a valid medical certificate, effective of the medical certificate being backdated if it says as informed by patient, I would recommend not accepting those medical certificates on condition that the employer make it very clear to employees that those medical certificates will not be accepted. And it has to say, as per the doctor or as per my professional opinion, something like that, but not as informed by patient. Now discussing the final part of section 23, and then I'm going to end the video off with a quick discussion on fraudulent medical certificate. Then an employer cannot expect an employee to give a medical certificate for paid sick leave if the employee lives on the employer's premises, and it's unreasonable to expect them to produce a medical certificate unless the employer assisted them with obtaining it. I assume that the legislator here was thinking specifically of farm workers who live on remote farms who do not have transportation, where it would be unreasonable to expect them to produce a medical certificate given that they live on a remote farm. Ending this video off with a final discussion on fraudulent medical certificate. Quick reference to section 24, just so that you are aware of it. The provisions of section 22 and 23 do not apply to where there was a workplace injury or a disease that was contracted as a result of something in the workplace, where that employee will be compensated by the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. And because I didn't say it at the beginning of this video, a reminder that these videos are for educational purposes, and my hope is that they are helpful, but I cannot detail every exception or every possible scenario in these videos. So it's just important that for your specific scenario, take this information but supplement it either by reading up or, if necessary, contacting a professional to assist you. Moving on to our final topic, fraudulent medical certificate. Now, how this usually plays out. If you have read my credentials, then you might know that I have chaired somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 hearings in my career. I have lost count, but I do know that it is within that range. And that means that I have done many hearings for dishonesty related to medical certificates in various forms. The most common one, or probably the one that is the most easy to pick up, is where there is a valid medical certificate that was issued to the employee, but then that medical certificate is altered. And usually that is the dates are changed on it. How this is picked up is, firstly, you can usually see that the dates have been changed if they weren't changed very well. Or a medical certificate often states the person is going to be absent from this date to return back to work on this day. Now, the ones that I've done hearings for, I think I've done over 10 hearings where somebody changes the from this day to this day, but then doesn't change the will return back to work on this day. So then the dates look a bit funny. Those medical certificates have been manually altered. Generally, they're picked up by simply looking at it and noticing that they look a bit strange. If you as an employer are suspicious that a medical certificate might have been altered, but you are unsure, scan it in, send it to the doctor, and ask them to verify the dates that they wrote on the medical certificate. Dishonesty around medical certificates is a dismissible offense. That doesn't mean that an employee can automatically be dismissed. There must still be a hearing and a fair procedure, and it also doesn't mean that there will be a hearing and it will result in the outcome of a dismissal. It would need to be severe mitigating circumstances to deviate from the outcome of dismissal, because dishonest conduct in general and also relating to medical certificates is a dismissible offense. I would here also recommend that your sick leave policy clearly state that, because a lot of employees do not realize the severity of altering a medical certificate, and that is in my sick leave policy. The other one that we see is a little bit more difficult to pick up, and it is also more difficult to deal with. And that is what we commonly refer to it as fake doctors. So how you can check this, I have provided a link below specifically on the Health Professions Council website. You can look up the name of the doctor, or if they have provided it, not the practice number, but the registration number, determine whether this person, if they are claiming that they are a medical doctor, of course, if they're claiming that they are a Allied Health Professions Council, then you would check on the Allied Health Professions Council website. I've also linked that down below. On the Health Professions Council website, you can type in their name to determine whether or not this doctor does exist. If you don't find them there, or you are still doubtful, but I would recommend, because this does take some time to receive the outcome, first check online And then as a secondary thing, to email the Health Professions Council, send them a scanned version of the medical certificate and ask them to kindly confirm whether or not the person is in actual fact a doctor that is registered. Now, when doing these hearings, the number one response that I have always gotten as to why this medical certificate is that the person says, I did not know that the doctor was not registered. Now, this is very difficult to prove, whether or not the employee did or did not know that the doctor was registered. The first thing is that the individual could be pretending to be a doctor. The more likely one, and the one that we see more often, is that there are individuals who sell medical certificates to employees. How we've gone about proving this in the past is we have sent individuals through to the physical location to verify whether the person actually looks like they've set up a practice or if they're just selling medical certificates. If you do happen to send an individual there and see that somebody is selling medical certificates, please kindly contact the Health Professions Council to report this. Now, sending somebody out to go check that is not always easy because a lot of the time these kind of medical certificate shops move around and it becomes very difficult to track where it came from. To have a stronger case around this, I would recommend to include in your sick leave policy that it is the responsibility of the employee to ensure that the practitioner who they go to is registered and detail exactly what they can expect should they issue a medical certificate where the person indicates that they are a medical doctor. You have evidence to prove that the person is not a registered doctor. And that is also in my sick leave policy. Now, a final point, and this is a major frustration and concern that I have, is there are some doctors, depending on where you are practicing, you might know them in your area, but I'm only familiar with the ones in the Western Cape, who are registered in terms of the Health Professions Council, but they are sort of famous for booking employees off for extended periods of time. For example, the one that we commonly see from a particular doctor in the Western Cape is booking employees off for stomach ache or back ache for a week to 2 weeks at a time. I have, and employers have, reported these doctors to the Health Professions Council for them to do an investigation, and there isn't much that we can do about it other than to accept them on condition that they are valid medical certificates and that they comply with the ethics code as per the Health Professions Council guidelines. It is a genuine frustration. If you happen to see these, I do ask that you report it to the Health Professions Council. And while these investigations might take a long period of time before anything comes of them, or maybe nothing does come of it, but the more that these doctors are reported, the more likely it is that the Health Professions Council can attempt to put a stop to it. One way that we usually pick this up is if employees live in a certain area and the business is in a certain area, and then suddenly they go to a doctor who is very far from them and they are booked off for an extended period of time, and it usually states the medical condition there, and it is a very vague medical condition around aches and pains and things that are actually quite difficult to show any physical symptoms of. On the topic of abuse or potential misuse of sick leave, I'm not going to discuss the details of it. All that I would like to say for this video is that yes, an employee has a right to privacy to their medical condition, meaning they do not have to disclose it to the employer unless it is a danger to other individuals. They have that right, but an employer, without asking what the medical condition is, can verify the legitimacy of medical certificates to ensure that there are no disputes around that. My sick leave clause that I spoke about at the beginning of this video does include a clause around that to clearly state to employees that an employer can verify a medical certificate, and that an employer can also request that an employee go to a particular doctor to determine whether the employee is fit for duty or not. That falls under the medical incapacity discussion that I will cover in another video if you are interested in that. And that brings us to the end of today's video. Please let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see in future videos, and also it is very, very helpful for me to continue to bring you these videos if you like and subscribe to my channel.